Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, 2/22/17. And if you don't like it digitally, it's the 22nd of February. And today a deadline looms at about the very hour that I am speaking to you at Standing Rock in North Dakota. And on the same day, I want to credit the fine folks at Madison's Center for Media and Democracy, that's in Wisconsin, and they sought access to documents that were part of the treasure trove, I would call them love letters, of one Scott Pruitt when he was the Attorney General of Oklahoma. And he recently was moved to Washington and promoted to Director of the EPA by the Trumpster. And these documents should have been really considered by the Senate before they voted to confirm Scott Pruitt, because what they show is that he has a deep love affair with the Koch brothers, with Devon Energy, and with other extractors and polluters that came under his purview as the Attorney General of Oklahoma. He has longtime financial ties to the Koch brothers, and some of that teases out in these emails. And here's an example of some of the correspondence that has been released. And this was a love letter to Scott Pruitt. Thank you to your respective bosses and all they're doing to push back against Obama's EPA and its axis with liberal environmental groups to increase energy costs for Oklahomans and American families across the states. That came from Matt Ball over at Americans for Prosperity. And that's where the Koch brothers funnel their money to buy influence with mostly Republican leaders across the country. So these documents were released on order of an Oklahoma judge. The emails, some of which surfaced back in 2014, show his close ties to the energy industry. And one thing that did surface in the confirmation hearings, but didn't seem to matter to Republicans, is that in one case, his office accepted a draft of a letter from a lobbyist for Devon Energy and then published it, mailed it, without making any changes. So that means that lobbyists were writing letters that Scott Pruitt put his signature over. And he's likely to do the same as EPA director. Now, not all of the documents have been released. There are still a few that have been held back by the government in Oklahoma, and we'll see if they do surface. I want to credit the fine folks at Smog Blog. And Steve Horn, who I've talked about quite a bit, he's been a regular guest on this show since I was introduced to him 6-7 years ago by one of the founders of the Center for Media and Democracy. And Steve Horn publishes frequently at the Smog Blog, and he takes apart and examines carefully some of these emails and other correspondence that have been released. And in particular, I've linked to the Smog Blog piece so that you can see some of the back and forth between Pruitt, the people who write him big checks, and the industries that he not only goes soft on, but he sued the federal EPA to try to protect some of these Oklahoma-based companies. And here's a letter they published from Stuart Solomon. He's the COO of Public Service Company. That's the utility in Oklahoma. And Scott, I wanted to tell you personally how much I appreciate your efforts to pave the way for a state solution to meeting the RHR challenge. This has to do with haze that was coming from smokestacks in Oklahoma, some of which I guess were owned by this Tulsa-based utility. And so what he did was run interference for them and help scuttle a report that had been published just before Pruitt became the Attorney General of Oklahoma. So I encourage you to leaf through that and read it for yourselves, and you'll get a good idea of just who has the loyalties of Scott Pruitt. Meanwhile, in North Dakota, the protests and the water protectors encampment there at Standing Rock has been thinning out over the last few weeks. Some of it because the Native American leader, Dave Archambault, has said, get out of here. We're going to fight this in court. And the protesters are dispirited. There are many people who don't support Dapple Dave, as he has been tagged by some of the more aggressive or assertive protesters. But there is flooding that is impending on the area where they've been camping. And so nature may evict them if the sheriff and the other law enforcement officers are unable to do so. They've been ordered to leave by 2 o'clock local time today, and I'm right at that point right now as I'm recording this, so if there are confrontations, I'll certainly report on it tomorrow. Now, this is really rich because the Attorney General of North Dakota has invoked environmental concerns as the reason why these environmental protesters need to leave the scene. They are concerned that the trash at the protest camps poses an ecological risk if it were washed downstream by any flooding that might occur. What bullshit. I mean, these people are just shameless. Nick Cowan, age 25, has been there for more than 2 months, and he noted that one of his neighbors set fire to their shanty or lean-to. I'm not sure exactly what it was. And Cowan said, well, it's an act of defiance. He said he didn't set the fire, but the message is, if you're going to make us leave our home, you can't take our space. We'll burn it to the ground and let the earth take it back before you take it from us. Now, some of the people plan to stay. They're not planning a violent confrontation, but we have seen the brutal tactics used on them by the law enforcement teams in the past, and so we can't be surprised if that happens again. I want to credit Kevin Gostola, and I guess I do this pretty often now, but he's a remarkable young journalist who publishes at Shadowproof, and he took a look at a suppressed Justice Department report that clearly states that evicting these protesters and bulldozing over their concerns by building this pipeline is a gross violation of the treaty rights of the Lakota and the Cheyenne River Sioux tribes, and also the Standing Rock Sioux. And this is a serious issue, but of course Donald Trump doesn't care about it. And we have a memo written by Hillary Tompkins, solicitor at the Interior Department, and I'm sorry, I misstated that as the Justice Department. It was Interior. And she did an analysis. And she said if the Corps ultimately does decide, that's the Corps of Engineers, to authorize the easement to complete the pipeline, additional tribal consultation is necessary to develop conditions for the authorization that will protect the tribe's rights and interests in and around Lake Oahe. The memo was filed in a federal court in Washington as part of the Standing Rock Sioux and Cheyenne River tribes' efforts to halt the drilling. Earth Justice lawyer Jan Hasselman, who represents the Sioux, called the memo hugely significant. And he said it's more of the same. We've seen from this administration taking thoughtful and considered work and tossing it in the garbage. So what this memo does is it outlines the treaty law, and going back to 1851 and 1868, they established the boundaries of the Great Sioux Reservation. And Tompkins, who wrote this memo, says that a significant portion of Lake Oahe remains within the outer boundary of the Standing Rock and Cheyenne River Sioux reservations. The tribes also have on-reservation hunting and fishing rights in the land used to create this. The memo also notes that the Corps of Engineers rejected routing the pipeline 10 miles north of Bismarck, but approved the route that is about a half mile from the border of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. And here I am coining a new phrase, hydro-apartheid, because what this clearly shows is that the interests of the mostly white population in Bismarck and the prospect that this pipeline could spill and foul a water supply. The Army Corps of Engineers decided it was okay to potentially foul the water supply of the Native Americans who have treaty rights over the non-native population of Bismarck that has no treaty rights. This is clear racism, alive and well in the United States today. I'm disappointed to report to you that Sabrina de Souza has been taken into custody in Portugal and is likely to be extradited to Italy in the next 3 or 4 days. I have interviewed Sabrina de Souza the former CIA officer, several times. And in today's show file, I'm linking to 2 of those interviews in case you're saying, who the hell is Sabrina D'Souza? Well, it goes back to the botched raid in Milan, where 25 or 26 CIA officers were part of a team, and we kidnapped in broad daylight an Egyptian cleric whose tag is Abu Omar, and we renditioned him to be tortured in Egypt. It is one of the ugliest moments that we know about of the Bush administration's use of so-called extraordinary rendition. Now, 26 Americans, including D'Souza, were convicted in absentia by the Italian judicial system. The original event was in 2003. The courts ruled back in 2009 that these people convicted in absentia will be subject to jailing in Italy if they can be caught. So D'Souza, who has dual citizenship and a Portuguese husband, moved to Portugal, and they have finally exercised the European Union warrant, and they have her in a jail in a town in Portugal, in Porto, and in the next 4 to 6 days, she will likely be flown to Italy. Now, she is facing 4 years in prison, but the Portuguese courts claim that they made a deal with the Italians that D'Souza will be given a new trial with an opportunity to present new evidence. Now, one of the critical things is that Sabrina D'Souza says that while she translated for people as they were planning the raid, she was not actually on the scene or even in Milan on the day of the raid. So she has an alibi, and it's fair to say that the people who authorized this raid, including Robert Lady, who was a CIA station chief, they've gotten away with it, and they have mostly been protected by our government, including the Obama administration. Robert Lady was picked up in Panama last year. I think it was in 2016. And after being briefly detained, there was apparently some intervention from high-level U.S. officials, and he was allowed to return to the United States instead of being extradited to Italy. So there's a double standard here, and the low-level officers who were involved are paying a price, at least D'Souza is, and the masterminds get away with it. And I went back to my email. I last corresponded with Sabrina D'Souza on December 5th of last year, and I wrote her a brief note. I've been thinking about you. Can you update your status for me and my listeners? And sadly, she wrote back, not today. My mother died yesterday, and I can't go to the funeral. So I am distraught. Let's chat later. And I'm sorry to say that I was being too polite. I didn't want to press her at a difficult time, and I regret that I didn't follow up and get an interview with her before she was taken into custody. You may have heard about this murky scheme to establish what is called a peace plan for Ukraine that was concocted by a guy named Andriy Artemenko, who is a Ukrainian billionaire of some sort. And Artemenko colluded with Michael Cohen, who is Donald Trump's personal lawyer. He is the counsel to the Trump Organization, still on the payroll there. And Felix Sater, a murky Russian-American business associate of the Trump Organization. The three of them concocted this plan, and then Cohen delivered the proposal to the White House to the attention of Mike Flynn, the former national security advisor who lasted 24 days. Now, we don't know if Trump has seen this plan, if he endorses it. It calls for lifting sanctions and allowing Russia to keep Crimea without any additional negotiation. And I accept that Russia has grabbed Crimea and they're not going to give it up. So realpolitik would say you could build some sort of a plan around acknowledging that Russia has Crimea and will keep it. But beyond that, the idea that these three people who have interests that aren't aligned with the national interest of the United States are able to gain access to high-ranking officers in the Trump administration, and the gopher, the delivery boy on this, was Trump's personal lawyer. I mean, this is so far beyond normal protocols that the term outrageous is kind of underwhelming in this context. Well, I have a new name for our Secretary of State, the former CEO of Exxon, whose name is Rex Tillerson. I call him Rexon. Well, Rexon and the general who took off his stars, John Kelly, who's now the head of Homeland Security, are in Mexico City today and tomorrow, trying to soothe tensions with the government of Enrique Peña Nieto. This is after the memos that surfaced earlier this week that say that we're going to deport people across the border into Mexico, even if they're not Mexicans. And we know that lots of people come from Central and South America through Mexico to get to the United States, and this can lay a big burden on Mexico that they're probably not able to absorb. And discussion of the wall proposal may also take place. Kelly has ordered the early planning for the construction of 3 sections of wall. He announced yesterday that there would be a stretch in California about 26 miles, another one in Texas about 26 miles, then a phase that would cover 151 miles in Arizona and Texas. And then the third phase, which is unspecified, is over 1,000 miles. And according to a Guardian report citing CNN, they say that experts say that the third phase is a fantasy, not under serious construction, and that while Trump always insists that it will be a wall, that in many places that is not physically feasible. And so the fantasy comes into conflict with reality, and the sick joke that Mexico's going to pay for it, well, that remains to be seen. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Susan Gavay, Tim McKay, Jim Garrison, Carla Mahoney. They're very generous in their monthly support, and I invite you to join in. Come on over to peterbcollins.com. You click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber, takes you to the sign-up page, shows you the options, $5, $10, $20 a month, or $50 annual subscription. And new annual subscribers earn a bonus book if you give me a mailing address in the continental United States. Well, the Jewish community in this country is uneasy with Donald Trump and the anti-Semitic comments and vibes that emanate from Steve Bannon and other members of his administration. And you know, last week at that bizarre news conference, Trump called on a reporter who he knew was Jewish because he was wearing a Jewish skull cap, a yarmulke, a keppah, as some people call it. And it was a really weird exchange because the reporter was very gentle on Trump and just raised the question about anti-Semitism. His pointed remark was, I wonder what you say to those among the Jewish community in the States and in Israel and maybe around the world who believe and feel that your administration is playing with xenophobia and maybe racist tones. Well, Trump told the guy to sit down, complained that it wasn't the easy question that he had expected, and proceeded to talk about his Electoral College win, which, has nothing to do with that unless he believes that the Electoral College is mostly populated by Jewish Americans. I don't know. At any rate, he then explains that because his daughter converted and married an Orthodox Jew and he has Jewish grandchildren, that's the end of the story. And last night on CNN, there was an exchange between a woman named, Kaylee McEnany, and Stephen Goldstein, who is the executive director of the Anne Frank Center. And when she asked Goldstein, do you think the president does not like Jews and is prejudiced against Jews? Goldstein said, you bet. And then when McEnany, played the kid's card, saying, gosh, does he hate his daughter? Does he hate his son-in-law? Goldstein said, you know what, Kaylee? I am tired of commentators like you on the right trotting out his daughter, trotting out his son-in-law as talking points against the president's anti-Semitism. They're Jewish, but that is not a talking point against anti-Semitism, and that is a disgrace. Have you no ethics? Well, I think this is a really good point, and I'm glad to see some Jewish Americans really pushing hard about what's been going on. And we've had 53 Jewish community centers receiving threatening calls. We had the Jewish gravestones toppled in a cemetery in St. Louis over the weekend. And the president finally did speak up at an African-American museum yesterday, as we reported. and he read some stuff that somebody else had written for him about how he deplores all this. But he didn't mention a broader notion of intolerance in this country and the routine attacks on Muslim community centers and mosques. The community in Kansas, in the small town of Garden City, where there is a group of Somalis who pray at a mosque, their mosque was attacked last October by a group of thugs who said that they wanted to kill as many Muslims, cockroaches as they called them, as they could, by detonating explosives, kind of like Tim McVeigh in Oklahoma City, using fertilizer. And the plot was interrupted, but we've never heard Trump talk about that. And just on Monday, on the central coast of California, in the town of Goleta, a Muslim center was vandalized, and there has been no notice of that from Trump. Now, also, we have to ask if the Donald is psychic. Now, I believe that he is paranoid. I believe he is delusional. I believe many of the descriptors, narcissistic, that we have heard applied to him. But psychic? Not so sure. But you may know that last Saturday at his Love Fest, the rally in Florida, he made a reference that puzzled everybody about violence in Sweden caused by immigrants. And 2 days later, well, incidents have caught up with the ravings of Trump. Because yesterday, residents of a northwestern suburb of Stockholm, predominantly inhabited by new immigrants, clashed with police officers. 20 to 30 masked men threw stones and other objects at police officers in the suburb of Rinkeby after the police arrested a man on suspicion of dealing drugs. So, Trump's unhinged comment now has facts, and his supporters will claim that he was a visionary who knew this was going to happen. It's weird. Now we are told that there's a fight inside the cabinet of the Trump administration as the bathroom wars rage on the political right in this country. Turns out that Jeff Sessions doesn't agree with Betsy DeVos. DeVos or DeVos? She initially resisted signing the order to rescind protections for transgender students in public schools. And Jeff Sessions, who strongly opposes this special carve-out for certain groups of people, fought DeVos on the issue, pressed her to relent because he could not go forward without her consent. The order must come from both Justice and Education departments. And it appears that Betsy DeVos has caved. But we'll see how this one plays out. Meanwhile, a federal judge ruled in Texas that the state cannot cut off Medicaid dollars to Planned Parenthood in reaction to those secretly recorded and selectively edited videos taken by anti-abortion activists in 2015. U.S. District Judge Sam Sparks in Austin followed up on a delay, a hold that he put on the decision back in January. And Texas is now the 6th state where federal courts have kept Planned Parenthood eligible for Medicaid, even though Republican right-wing extremists have tried to pander to their base and cut off that funding. Mission creep in Syria? Get ready for it. General Joseph Votel, the head of the U.S. Central Command, is asking for more American troops there. And he says we need to take on a larger burden ourselves. Now, it's unclear because Trump, of course, has a secret plan to vanquish ISIS and bring peace to the Middle East. He hasn't bothered to share it with us so far, and he did instruct his new Secretary of Defense, Mad Dog Mattis, to deliver a plan within 30 days. We haven't quite hit that deadline, so it remains to be seen if we will see further escalation of ground troops in Syria. Bill Maher can be a real asshole, and he really is showing that in an interview that he gave over the phone yesterday to a New York Times reporter. He is saying that the appearance of Milo Yiannopoulos on his HBO show last Friday night actually helped expose the incendiary right-wing personality's views to a wider audience and hasten his sudden downfall. Now, if you've watched the interview, Maher was slobbering over this gay man, And he bonded with him on simply protecting their respective rights to be outrageous. And I just thought it's described here as a chummy and conciliatory conversation with Milo. And I didn't see the post-broadcast that's on YouTube called Overtime, but I'm told that Milo made even more inflammatory remarks that seemed to go unchallenged. So a quote from Maher: "Well, I said sunlight is the best disinfectant. Then we had Milo on, despite the fact that many people said, 'Oh, how dare you give a platform to this man?' What I think people saw was an emotionally needy Ann Coulter wannabe trying to make a buck off the left's propensity for outrage. And by the end of the weekend, by dinner time Monday, he's dropped as a speaker at CPAC, dropped by Breitbart, and his book deal falls through. As I say, sunlight is the best disinfectant. You're welcome." Well, this is no thanks to you, Bill Maher. You did not expose him in any way. It was, in fact, I think your putting a spotlight on him that led a weird group to publish a video. Where did this come from? Conservative group called the Reagan Battalion resurfaced the 2016 interview in which Yiannopoulos endorsed sexual relations between older men and younger boys. And as I point out, I do defend the right of Yiannopoulos to express himself, even if I am offended by what he says. But to see Bill Maher try to claim credit for this, I think that exposes more about Bill. You may recall last year in Virginia, a 24-year-old news reporter for Channel 7 in Roanoke, Allison Parker, was doing a live stand-up on their morning show. And an assailant came up and shot her dead on live television. And we learned that another reporter at that same TV station, a guy named Chris Hurst, had fallen in love with Allison, and they had secretly moved in together so as not to alert their colleagues at the TV station. So Hurst has resigned from his TV station because they sent him on an assignment last October to cover a similar shooting at a Roanoke railcar manufacturing company. And it really upset him, and so he decided to get out of the TV news business and run for the legislature in Virginia, opposing a Republican who was endorsed by the NRA. Now, before you think that Hurst is a hardliner in favor of gun control, he's kind of nuanced. He says that he wants to pass a law that would allow a gun violence protection order so that a court could take away somebody's guns. He ducked an opportunity to take a position opposing assault-style weapons, but he has this idea for a violence protection order, which, could help in some circumstances, but many of these events and crimes are so impulsive that I don't think that it would make a whole lot of difference. And finally, in Kuala Lumpur, it is invasion of the North Korean body snatchers. Malaysian police who are investigating the murder of Kim Jong-nam say attempts were made to break into the morgue where his body is being refrigerated and have demanded to question a senior North Korean diplomat. Now, 4 people have been arrested in the plot where 2 women were either part of the plot or were induced to spray the older brother of Kim Jong-un. He's a half-brother. They have different mothers. And Kim Jong-nam died shortly afterward. And they have not released any results of an autopsy. But the idea that people are trying to snatch his body just adds more bizarre weirdness to the whole story of North Korea. Thanks for listening to my News and Comment podcast, delivered every day on YouTube. I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.